Okay, recording.
Hello, Professor. How are you?
Second, is it on yet? Yes, now it is. Okay.
Recording.
All right.
How are you, Professor?
Hi, how's it going, man? Thanks for having me back.
It's an amazing read, opening closed guard, story behind the film. This is, like I said, this is such an amazing read. Quite a few, like for example, right off the bat here, when we start with the Japanese chapter with Matsubara, there is just like right off the bat, some statements here that can really open up a few good debates. For example, the Gracie Jiu Jitsu, self-defense, MMA, and how Judo is completely different. While I myself tend to think otherwise, but so should I start with the first question, or you want to say something first?
No, just thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed the book. I'm happy to talk about anything, even like if there's some level of criticism or anything you don't agree with. I think that's what's important in discussions, that people don't get so partisan when it comes to these things. It drives me crazy when you talk to people and it's like they can't disagree with you and not get offended by disagreement. Like, I don't think it should be that way. I think debate should be open. And if you disagree with me, or if you showed me wrong, like that shouldn't upset anyone, right? So I try to have this approach with people. So feel free to like really voice, what you thought of the book or conclusions of not only myself but of other interviewees. And I think that's what's happy, discussion and progress is when we're open to criticism and divergent opinions.
No, Sensei said that when you're about to discuss, don't think about winning or losing the debate, but think of really reaching a common ground. Because once you think about winning or losing, then no one will get anywhere, basically.
Yeah.
And I find that that's really good to. It's a good mindset to have in order to really learn. So before we start, here, like I saw the interviews, and is this what the movie will be like, or is there something more than just the interviews?
It is not an adaptation of the film in any way. This is more, think of it as a diary, like a traveling diary, a journal, right, throughout the trip. It wasn't written during the trip, but I was basically trying to like remember how I thought and where my mind was in the beginning and what the feelings were and what the idea was. And I think there's somewhat of an evolution of the author, me, like in the book. Like at some point you see me evolving throughout the process. And I thought that would be a more fun read than just dropping facts on people. I didn't want to do that. I wanted the facts to be introduced by the interviewees and me drawing some conclusions based off my experience as producer, competitor, professor, an observant, and a fan of the art ultimately. And it's kind of all mixed up, so it really reads more like a diary, I think, than an actual history book, and that was the goal.
Here, I want to start with the first judoka, Ryoichiro Matsubara. You say that his dojo is like your dream dojo. He said something that's quite heavy. He says that, and I quote, "So if you look at Gracie Jiu Jitsu, they have a lot of techniques related to self-defense, unlike Judo, which is developed as a sport. I think that's why BJJ and MMA were combined and developed." So before I get to that, there's also there's a part of the interview where you ask him, why did Judo become so stand-up oriented? And he basically talks about self-defense and how you should be always ready and on your feet in case of multiple assailants, etc. So here, when he says, if you look at Gracie Jiu Jitsu, is he talking about how BJJ evolved like more towards the ground, or when he's talking about like how you see, for example, Pedro Valente or Rickson Gracie, they say, always drill self-defense, not just sparring for sports? Or is he talking about the discipline in and of itself? Because as I see Judo more fit for self-defense, since you're quick on your feet, rather than really taking it slow and building up like in BJJ.
I think the first thing is we have to define what we mean by self-defense, because it's such a broad category. Sometimes, like I find myself that people are arguing, they're fighting over something, but they don't even agree. They think they're fighting about the same thing, but they're really fighting about two different things. And they're doing this right here, and they're completely missing one another, right? I see. First of all, I don't. I'm a critic of. I mean, I think for practical purposes, drilling a move without randori, and I think that the true beauty, I mean, the genius was, to me as a competitor, randori. That was the great leap that judo took. Like, you have to have actual friction to teach the body how to react intelligently. Like, you can't drill a move your whole life and expect it just that alone to make you a good fighter. It's not going to work. You need both. You need the practice, the repetition, but you also need the conflict, right? And I think a lot of self-defense that is taught out there doesn't have that. They just teach you to memorize moves. And everyone knows that memory is garbage. Memory doesn't work. Okay? If I ask you to name your 4 grandparents, if I ask you to name your 4 grandparents, it takes you 5 seconds to remember their names, at least. It's not something that comes quickly. Now, imagine in a real life situation where your life's in danger and you have to react on the spot. If you require the body communicating to the brain going, if you require, it's too long. Your body has to think for itself. It has to reply automatically and instinctively. And randori does that. So that's the first problem. The second problem you have is, what is self-defense in terms of how many people are you fighting? Because Matsubara makes a very good point. Like, in Brazil, it's more of a machismo culture where, it's one-on-one. And I remember when I was a kid, we had to fight all the time. Like, Brazil, I mean, it's not like Hawaii. If you've been to Hawaii, like in Hawaii, you fight every day for no reason. People are just fighting all the time. It's a cultural thing. Brazil is less, but it's not unlike that. When I was a kid, we had to fight all the time. It was a manly thing to do, was to put up with the fight.
Circle around and they watch you fight, basically.
Yeah, and the biggest shame wasn't losing. The biggest shame was someone intervening. If one of your friends or your parents or someone came over to help you, that was like, oh, it's like the biggest no. Just let me lose with honor. There was. It's funny because there was, even amongst children, there was an honor code. You didn't hit the balls, you didn't eye gouge, biting was girly, pulling hair was girly. Like, you couldn't do that. Like, even as children, we understood these things. Like, there was an honor code there. And I think that became somewhat ingrained in jiu-jitsu. And it's an aspect of Brazilian culture. And Matsubara points it out. He mentions the Hugo Duarte versus Rickson Gracie event where people are watching and no one's intervening. And that's my experience as well. That coincides with my experience. I think Jigoro Kano had in mind a different aspect of self-defense where there are multiple attackers, which in this case, it makes a lot more sense to remain on your feet than to go to the ground. In fact, going to the ground, even one-on-one, is dangerous because you never know if someone else is going to break that code of honor and attack you. I think jiu-jitsu, or niwaza for that matter, is great for one-on-one when rules are established that no one's going to intervene. But the second you're on the street, there's nothing really stopping anyone else from intervening or pulling a gun. So I normally joke with my students, the best self-defense there is track and field, run in the opposite direction. That's the number one. Number two, it's not jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or judo. Number two to me is boxing, because you can hit and run in boxing. Hit, run. You can actually fight multiple people and get away with it. Jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu for multiple attackers is the worst. I think judo is a little bit better, but still not great because you're still grappling with people. You still got to hold them. If you have 2-3 guys,
it takes time. Yeah.
Yes, it's not something you can. And we're not even factoring weapons here. You throw weapons in the mix, and you don't even know what you don't know. You don't know how many people you're fighting. You don't know if they have a gun, slippery ground, on a hill, curb, obstacles, tables. So there's so many variables. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't like the I'm very careful when I talk about self-defense, but I think Matsubara does make a point. I think that what survived in Brazil was what we could call as combat judo, if you want to call it that, like a more conflict-oriented version of judo. When I mean conflict, I mean like more combat, real fighting as in MMA. And that survived through the Gracie family largely. It was less sport, more combat-oriented.
Wasn't Rickson that said, if you want to train something, make sure it works in Vale Tudo, something like that, or train as if you're preparing for Vale Tudo, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you ever said that, but like, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You need the reality of practice. And this is like I'm very respectful towards judo. And I've never trained judo, but I'm an observant of the culture. And I think that comes across in the book, but I think that there's a flaw there in terms of it becoming too sport oriented and it lost some of its martial aspects. You know, it still exists, but it's not mainstream. And I think jiu-jitsu
How, but like, this is my question. A lot of I get this all the time. It's moving towards sports, and I get it. Like, every martial art has this unrealistic aspect to it. Say BJJ, you have your berimbolo and lapels, and you have, when you go towards wrestling and judo, you have the worst crime of all, which is turtling. But what do you mean by moving towards sports? Because I still see two people standing, breaking each other down, and eventually slamming someone.
Yeah, I guess like what I mean is the more rules you have, and I'm not saying that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in its sport format is much better. It's pretty much the same in terms of, like, it's very sport oriented. It's very tactical. Too many interruptions. Too many things are not realistic in combat. But like I'm not a fan of the interruptions. I think that's my biggest one. It's not the stand-up part is very somewhat realistic. You get someone with a coat, you'd be doing judo, especially, I mean, if you have a jacket on. But in terms of like the interruptions, I think that in a real fight, like, things can or can't get interrupted. That's it. That's the problem with self-defense, is we can't even define, because it's such a big category. Like, is it going to be interrupted? Because I've seen fights get interrupted after 5 seconds, and I've seen it go on for 5 minutes and no one stops it. So it just depends on what scenario you're talking about. I think that, for a variety of reasons, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu played a huge role, or Brazilian Judo, like I like to call it, a huge role in the development of MMA. And for all practical purposes, I say this, MMA is the closest thing to this. It's as real as it gets. It's the closest thing to a real fight you can get to within a rule set, right? Like, if you're going to practice in a sport format, I think MMA is the most efficient martial art ever devised, because it embodies everything that works.
And gi MMA as well. I think that, like, combat Sambo, but because clothing can be really deadly and efficient.
Yeah. No, I think that a lot of people miss that, because they always think that no gi is more realistically, because the argument always goes, I've never seen anyone walking around with a gi. I've never seen anyone walking around with a rash guard. People walk around with clothes, Granted, a t-shirt,
like, you can still do cross chokes, etc., with like your typical t-shirt. People don't they underestimate a t-shirt.
But but even that scenario, and I agree with you, I think clothes is closer to gi than it is to no gi, a t-shirt, for example. But I think people miss all that. And at the end of the day, it's still, we can't put the finger on what self-defense is, because the problem with self-defense is there are no rules. Once you have a rule set, whether it's judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or MMA, or anything else, you have boundaries. And when you have boundaries, now you can develop strategies. With self-defense, you'd have no boundaries, because with self-defense, you don't. What's a no-go? A knife, a gun, eye poking, biting. Who's going to stop you? There's no ref. So we're talking about a situation here that has no frontiers. So because of that, you can't really have an efficient strategy. The closest thing to an efficient strategy to me is having your mind quick to react. And that comes through live action, randori. You're going to get that through teaching your body how to react quickly without thinking. This is why I'm very critical of some forms of self-defense out there that don't have a realistic element to them. They only have the drilling, but they don't have combat. Like, you have to teach people how to deal with someone when they're on top of you, or trying to take you down, or trying to punch you. These situations teach your body to think faster than so you don't rely on your brain to do the thinking in the heat of battle.